We are back, and we are joined now by Hal Singer, professor in the economics department at the University of Utah, managing director at Econ One, and the executive director of the Utah Project, which is an institute studying antitrust and consumer protection. Hal, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me.
So, let's just start here because inflation is the refrain that you hear all the time when people in the media are talking about the economy. And of course, we've gone through this on the show before. There was naturally occurring inflation in the pandemic because our supply chains were disrupted. There were work stoppages, and prices did go up during the pandemic. But now, in specific sectors, like housing and groceries and meat, they've stayed up and profits have soared for these companies. The Harris platform seems to understand that, but the media doesn't cover that at all. If you could just do some myth busting here for us.
Yeah, thanks for that one. Yeah, I hope we can talk about price gouging. It seems like a very sensitive subject these days. In fact, The
Right.
Economist magazine said that if we even utter the words, we could undermine the faith and the
Can
and
we
proper
pull up
functioning
your
of the
tweet on this? I'm sorry to cut you
capitalist.
off immediately, but this
That's
was
okay.
incredible. You highlighted this. This was a sentence in The Economist, this part here. Um, the claim of price gouging is simply not supported by the evidence, but it nonetheless erodes the faith in open markets that makes America prosperous. So, according to The Economist, talking about price gouging is wrong because capitalism, people may start to think critically about it. I don't know.
Who knew that they were such snowflakes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we should tread delicately here because I don't want like the entire financial market to collapse around our conversation of price gouging.
Yeah.
But let's go for it anyway. Yeah, it almost was something that couldn't be discussed in the media. You know, the media has their favorite kind of neoliberal commentators. They go back to the same ones. I don't know if I should name any names on the show, but you know, these guys just can't bring themselves to even accept for a moment the possibility that the firms in charge of setting prices, you know, in consolidated industries with massive price setting power, could have any culpability in driving inflation. And the other thing that would kind of cause me to go mad, as you mentioned, you know, we did have this bout of burst of inflation that was endemic, kind of economy wide. But afterwards, we only saw it kind of lingering in very specific sectors. And yet the Fed took this position like this is just any kind of old inflation. We should address it by throwing sand in the gears of the economy. It was pretty clear where it was coming from. It's like a fire in your house. You know, you identify where the fire is. You don't bulldoze the house. You go look and you find the room where the fire is. You know, you take it out. So we had it in just a few sectors. Housing accounted for a third, as you know, of the entire CPI. And we have this crazy mechanism that says we're gonna treat the cost of owned homes as if the imputed value is the rental thing. So rental drives everything in housing, you know. And now we learn, and we've known this for a while, that the rental markets in the United States have been subject to a massive, alleged, I should say, price fixing conspiracy, right? And so, you know, the idea that firms had no culpability in driving inflation is just nuts. And sadly, I think the only reason why economists can't say it, not all, but most, particularly those who kind of play in this industrial organization space and get quoted all the times, I worry that they are in a constant audition mode for corporate consulting gigs. And if you bite the hand that feeds you, you're not going to be able to sustain your customary lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean that does seem to be at play here, for sure. And you mentioned the digital price fixing done by RealPage. I guess that's a great place to start. Where I mean, a lot of these companies, I guess this RealPage is software. It's owned by a private equity firm, and there are estimates that in certain metro areas of the country, it's 70% of large apartment buildings are using this software called RealPage, where it's essentially a digital price fixing scheme by these companies where they come together, they put their information into software, and they basically artificially say like, hey, you know, we don't need to compete with each other. We can set the prices for rent here, and we'll all make a boatload of money, even though that's like basically artificially working together in an illegal way. So that's why the DOJ filed this antitrust lawsuit on Friday. This was a part of what Harris proposed, right? Cracking down on corporate landlords. This was in her platform that she rolled out. So For me, if this is continuity from the Biden administration with Jonathan Cantor and Lena Khan, that would be encouraging. But I guess, Hal, what's your take on this lawsuit, what it means for her platform if she were to win, and her agenda if she were to win in November?
Yeah, well, the lawsuit's huge, and you hit on a few of the aspects, but just let me tell you, coming from an antitrust perspective, what's really pernicious here, what's really dangerous, is the sharing of competitively sensitive information across what should be horizontal rivals, two different landlords competing with each other in theory in the same neighborhood. They're sharing with each other through this intermediary their vacancy rates, and then they're basically, the second thing that's offensive is they're turning over their pricing decision to a third party, which is suggesting to them, by how much they should go up in the rent. And you mentioned the 70% number. I don't think you'd need to get to 70% of a neighborhood or of a city before you can effectuate, a pricing conspiracy that touches everyone, right? That is, even the landlords who aren't using RealPage, they see all their rivals going up by 14, 15, some ungodly, percentage each year. Why not do it? Why not just follow that umbrella and go under this higher prices? And it leads to, massive price inflation across the board. And we've known this is going on. By the way, the DOJ was a bit late to the party. There's been private plaintiffs who have already filed against RealPage. This is no surprise. And what was amazing, I just go back to the mainstream, kind of the economists, the neoliberals. Paul Krugman, God bless him, was bending over backwards to come up with alternative theories as to why prices were exploding in rental markets. And his theory, his pet theory, and he wrote at least 5 times stories about this, that the pandemic caused the demand for more space to go up because we were no longer working in buildings downtown, right? We're working out of our homes, so we needed bigger homes. And that's what was driving the price inflation.
He was, like, there were a lot of people in the economy who don't have that luxury, like people who make wages, as opposed to Krugman, who could maybe do it from his vacation home or something like that. I mean, so much of this working from home stuff, like analysis of the economy, that also feels like to benefit corporate landlords who want people to return to the office space that they rented already.
And my second favorite theory, just to pick on the New York Times, so I love them so dearly, but after Paul Krugman's, more demand to accommodate COVID, they ran with an editorial anyways, an op-ed on the elevator union. And if it was basically the elevator unions to blame, they were intransigent. They were digging in their heels for higher wages, and that was what was causing, inflation to spiral out in rental. It's been a lot. It's been a lot to take, but I go on walks and stuff just to cool down. I'm waiting for them to come to the light and see, what really was driving it. I'm not sure that they're there yet. Hopefully, they're following this lawsuit, though.
Well, what do you think? I mean, from a political perspective, the Democrats are gleaning from this because, I mean, the interest rates. I mean, it's finally been announced that they're going to. It had been anticipated, but in September they're finally going to cut rates at the Fed. But what's fascinating to see is how some, Biden administration, to their credit, and Harris continuing with this, doesn't seem to be taking the bite on this, like, hysteria in the media, or not taking the bite, taking the bait on this hysteria in the media, because, like, it doesn't really, if they don't crack down on them, they're just going to blame inflation and say that the Democrats can't manage the economy, right? And it's going to harm them regardless. So it's almost like they have to be more aggressive, and perhaps they've learned something in this regard, because then, it's already baked into the cake that the Republicans tend to pull better on managing the economy than the Democrats do. So then when they get in power and corporations take advantage of them, then there's inflation in these certain sectors, and then they get hit on it politically. So it's like they're cornered into acting to at least a certain degree. And you have to credit, of course, Lena Khan and how, Warren and stuff got Biden to put her in charge of the FTC. But that's one thing that I'm encouraged by in all of this.
Oh, when I say the Democratic Party was controlled by neoliberal economic thought for decades. I think that coming out of probably the 70s and 80s and the Carter experience. But, the idea was that they would move towards the Republicans and basically take a kind of corporatist view of the world. And there's been a real sea change, just in the last few years to actually think maybe it's the right economics, but it's also the right politics. I think this polls very well, to go out and say, look, we are going to point the finger at where, at who's causing the pain. We're not going to keep giving corporations, letting them off the hook. We know where it's coming from, and we're gonna name them. So I'm encouraged by the Harris proposals. I kind of wish that Biden would have taken a stronger tack while he was in the office. I felt that he was fairly accommodating to the folks who were responsible for inflating prices. He would, talk about shrinkflation, but I felt he refused to name names. There's a historical analogy. I just want to point out that Kennedy, when he was president, went after the steel companies. He named the industry, and he actually got them to roll back a series of major price increases by basically shaming him, using the bully pulpit. And I never saw Biden do that. It was kind of unfortunate to kind of watch it happen, watch what happened to his presidency as a result.
Right. I mean, he has difficulties using the bully pulpit. That's one of the problems, really, is he's not able to articulate some of the things that we wish. And I think it's reflected in seeing Harris surge ahead by repeating a lot of the same, I guess, ideas, right, in terms of ideological consistency as it related to things like antitrust in the economy that Biden implemented. But, in terms of housing, right, what do you take I'm less enthusiastic by about the focus on the middle class. I understand the politics behind it, but the focus on the middle class, home ownership, subsidizing home ownership, as opposed to, say, like running on things like we can repeal the Faircloth Amendment so we can build a public housing throughout the country as a way to combat the privatization of housing in this country. But I do like tackling it from two angles, right? Going after the digital price fixing by these companies on rent, while also constructing new homes and providing some sort of assistance for first-time home buyers. But what are the pros and cons? Do you share my view on the mixed bag nature of that?
It is a bit of a mixed bag, and look, if we can't just talk about supply. That's the YIMBY's favorite tact, is basically, again, exonerate the landlords for any kind of culpability for rental inflation. So if we just build and we kind of leave the price fixing, which hopefully is going to be taken care of, but there's another problem that you didn't mention, which is consolidation. And so what are happening is these equity funds are going in and they're buying up large swaths of apartments in the same neighborhood. And so what the YIMBYs and the defenders of the landlords love to do is show stats of how small the holdings are of private equity, across the nation. But of course, they're not just randomly scattering their ownership across the nation. They're targeting very specific neighborhoods, across the United States. And when they come in, they go heavy and they take in big footprints within the neighborhood. That also gives them pricing power. So I want to make sure, I hope that folks in the Harris administration and the economic team are paying attention here. It's not just adding supply, which I like, right? But we also have to come to grips with this notion of we cannot allow a single entity to own, a substantial share of the rental properties in a neighborhood. That's just a recipe for higher prices. You want to get to monopoly prices? Let one person own them all, right? So I wish that they kind of spoke about that a little more often.
Right. I mean, and there is still, I've mentioned Lena Khan a few times already, there is still a question as to whether she will be kept on, even though there is, seemingly ideological consistency on this front. She has not made a statement either way on that issue. And there's a lot of people in the media that are trying to pressure her, specifically big money donors to that campaign, taking the fight to the press because they so desperately want Lena Khan out of there for obvious reasons.
I know Harris could end this whole talk if she just came out right now and said that Lena Khan was going to continue to run the FTC. I kind of wish she would.
Yeah.
But I feel like there was a moment there where we actually thought, I think it was Reid Hoffman, might be controlling the strings. But I feel like Harris has come out so strong on this antitrust and price gouging talking points that it would be just logically inconsistent now turn around and to accommodate kind of the old neoliberal wing of the party. I hope she does the right thing.
I agree. And campaign rhetoric is, yes, just campaign rhetoric, but it's also you lock yourself in for expectations with the voters, right? So this is what you're tying yourself to in terms of your promises to a degree. Although a lot of that depends on the Senate, but we don't need to get fully into the election here because I wanted to talk about the grocery piece of this, and the that's an industry. I mean, meat processors, right? That is in nearly a monopoly. What I saw Robert Reich write this a few months ago, that 4 companies control processing of 80% of beef, nearly 70% of pork, almost 60% of poultry. And so when we were talking earlier about, yes, the naturally incurring inflation due to COVID, we now see that the grocers and these meat companies, right? They basically still have very high prices, but they're taking home record profits. You know, the CNBC is saying, "Oh, this is price fixing that she wants to do here when she's tackling price gouging." But I mean, this is textbook gouging because you can see it in their earnings reports. They're making record profits, but prices are still high.
Right. So let's talk about the groceries for a bit. I mean, there was a great admission yesterday in the Kroger Albertsons merger trial by a Kroger executive. This was an internal email that they showed during the trial today, admitting that they were gouging. That is, they were using a little bit of inflation as a pretext to raise their prices by more. And we saw this in spades, going on in the early part of the inflation days, jumping up and down. But, again, if we can't see it, if we're not even allowed to talk about price gouging, right, we're never going to get at it. The FTC put out a study that found that large grocery stores were engaging in price gouging. And of course, the Council of Economic Advisors has found that this margin increases were contributing somewhat. They found other factors as well to overall inflation. So this notion, you read this quote from the economists at the top, that the evidence suggests there has never been price gouging. It basically is like burying your head in the sand from all the evidence that's out there.
The Washington Post editorial board said the same thing, too. I don't know if it's a coincidence that Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post and Whole Foods, but that's another matter.
Yeah, and I don't know how much influence individual writers, but Catherine Rampell, came out and said that, and I'm paraphrasing, but Kamala Harris's discussion of price gouging smacked of communism. She was basically feeding the narrative of communism, and she needed to quit talking about this. She also thought, I just want to, as an antitrust guy, I got to say that antitrust is not going to solve this problem of gouging, right? Antitrust is first primarily focused on price fixing across multiple firms. So when Kroger, gouges unilaterally, that's not something that antitrust can get at. And antitrust can get at an individual firm who's setting prices when they use a restraint of trade to get that price higher. But if they're just exploiting opportunistically, a crisis, there's absolutely nothing that antitrust do, and there's no reason can do, and there's no reason for us to just sit back and kind of take this as consumers, right? I feel like what these neoliberals are saying is that we should let our defenses down. We should have no defenses against this kind of act. And 40 plus states have price gouging laws on the books, right? And we need a federal one because a lot of these states, as Zephyr Teachout wrote, a lot of these firms can evade the state laws if they're doing the gouging in some other state. Or setting it at a different level. And I just put the question this way, like, why would we ever, if we know that there's harm coming from a particular source, why would we ever not build up or erect a defense mechanism, right? Even if we never use it, just to have a defense against this level of attack. It just seems to me naive and almost encouraging firms to misbehave if we don't establish a federal price gouging law.
Well, I mean, you mentioned that antitrust suit against, or the FTC's blocking a merger of Kroger's and Albertsons. In their defense, they were essentially listing off, you let Walmart do it, you let X do it. Why don't you let us do this, right? We need to be able to compete in these markets, etc. The point, though, is that the market consolidation has got to that point. So there needs to be a buck. The buck needs to stop somewhere, right? Or you're enabling this, I guess, in terms of the consolidation piece. But also, federalizing these rules would be really important here. And do you think she could do that through executive order, or would that have to go through Congress? Is my question.
I think it would have to go through Congress. If she does it by executive order, it would immediately be challenged. And the courts these days are watching what they're doing to like Biden's student loan programs. I think it should go through Congress. And look, you may never even have to use it. It's just having the defense at your fingertips would put the firms on notice that if they exploit the next crisis, and by the way, this is not price controls and it's not economy wide, regardless of what Catherine Rampell said. This was just in the food industry, and it really wouldn't kick in until the next crisis. The idea is that when we get into the next crisis, we don't want to be in the same vulnerable position that we were in for this crisis. We're just sitting back and watching these prices spiral out of control. So why not at least have the defense mechanism in place, right? And one last thing is, you're not guilty until proven innocent. If the federal government were to bring a case against you, right, you could defend your unilateral price increase by appealing to, say, the costs that went up, right? And if you could demonstrate that your price increases were cost-based, you'd be off the hook. So the notion that this is somehow going to chill investment or innovation or send us back, or, in Catherine's words, communist era, is just a hyperbole.
Well, how about the expanded child tax credit that Kamala Harris is proposing? Is that communism, Hal?
I think that whenever we interfere with markets, it seems like it has a taint of communism, right? Because we're basically saying that we can't trust the markets are going to take care of this. But there's been great research on the advantages, the benefits of a child tax credit, and we basically want to allow people to at least have the choice to go back to work. The notion right now is that childcare is very expensive and it could be trapping folks in their homes and keeping them out of the labor market. So I think it's a great thing, and more power to her on that front as well.
Can you expand on the child tax credit and what it did do when we expanded it during COVID? I think the figures range from 40 to 50% of children being lifted out of poverty. She's essentially advocating for making that permanent, which was Joe Manchin killed that in the Build Back Better negotiations, but also offering $6,000 for a newborn for those qualifying families. What impact would that have, and basing that on the impact that it did have when it was in effect?
Well, you mentioned the benefits to children, but I also want to talk about the benefits to the parents as well. I mean, as workers in the labor market, what we want to do is build up this strong sense of security that workers have as a background, and that's going to give them greater bargaining power vis-a-vis their employers, in which they can demand higher wages. So there's so many beneficial effects, but I do think that we got a taste of it. During COVID, we watched what happened in labor markets, and we ought to learn those lessons and apply them generally. We should have strong and vibrant labor markets, and workers should feel secure in leaving and mobility, leaving their current employer and going to a next better job. And we don't want them to feel trapped or feel like because they had kids, it's going to somehow, impair their mobility. Keep on more of that, and not just during crises. Let's make that permanent.
But that is unfortunately, the Fed has taken an approach of essentially saying that there needs to be a certain level of insecurity in the labor market and some sort of level of unemployment, because they're more focused on the leverage that corporations have, less on the workers. That's just as somebody who works as an economist, right? How robust is that consensus on that front? I'm pretty pessimistic about the Harris administration being able to break from that economic consensus, because it's even the people in the Biden administration feel that way, or the Janet Yellens of the world.
Well, there was this old paradigm, and it still exists, in the minds of folks like Jason Furman, that workers and wage increases are somehow driving overall inflation. So we have to be careful not to allow the labor markets to overheat too much. But and he made these bold predictions that we wouldn't get inflation down unless unemployment reached something 8 or 9%. I can't remember the number, and that just turned out not to be true. Right? Unemployment remained low, and we came out of the inflationary period. And my thesis all along has been that workers are not contributing to it. If you think about how prices are generated in the economy, ask yourself, does an airline set its prices, based on the salaries that it's paying the flight attendants or the cleaning crew? I mean, it's just preposterous. And so I just want to say something really quick on the Fed. In their defense, I feel like we should go back and revisit the mandate in light of what happened in this episode, right? Their attitude was that they weren't going to start cutting interest rates unless and until they saw unemployment rise, and it basically never did. It didn't do it until just recently. So that was their excuse. I mean, and in part we're to blame that we set up this mandate. It basically says if the harm from higher interest rates does not manifest in the form of higher unemployment, don't do anything. Leave interest rates high. But it turned out they were really inflicting massive harms on the economy, right? They were locking people into homes, in their current homes. They were locking people into rentals who wanted to become homeowners because they couldn't afford to finance a mortgage. There were other harms as well, but those harms didn't manifest in the form of unemployment. So the Fed just kind of sat still. And I think it would be a healthy conversation for Congress to have to revisit the mandate and to force the Fed to be sensitive and cognizant to other harms that are inflicted on the economy from higher interest rates. Right now, they just don't feel it, and they don't have to feel it.
It's less, I guess, a criticism of the actions and more of that consensus and what the mandate has and the outdated nature of the mandate, right? To your point, I mean, it's based on an economic consensus that, I don't know, is like multiple decades out of date. It just doesn't reflect the reality. And we saw that in the way that unemployment was untethered from the actions of the Fed.
Yeah, there may have been an era, 50, 60 years ago in which wages and prices were intimately, inexplicably, intertwined, right? The shoe cobbler and other things like that. But, we've moved on, and it's a different economy now. And we should revisit this notion of how important, wages are to contributing to overall inflation. I would submit not very much.
Lastly here, I wanted to touch on some of her proposals on medicine, medical debt, and your take on that. She basically proposed that she wants to speed up the Biden administration's efforts to allow Medicare to negotiate with drug makers. We know that prices for some of these prescription medications are going to reduce in 2026 by somewhere from 40 to 80% on these really key drugs that people who are on Medicare use. What does that do for everyday people? And then that as well, her proposal to cancel medical debt. I think it reaffirms your point about just giving the average person more power in the economy.
That's right. But I want to talk about this allowing the government to use its buying power to push down the price of pharmaceuticals. It's amazing that the pharmaceutical lobby was so powerful that they captured large swaths of the Democratic Party, right? For decades. We couldn't even use that tool in our toolkit. And now, to get that legislation through on the first time, right?
The largest buyer of these drugs was barred from negotiate. It wasn't negotiating with the pharmaceutical manufacturers, so they're not using their economic buying power to their leverage in that negotiation. Keep going.
Right, because that would be communism, apparently.
Apparently,
and never mind the fact that the drug prices are higher in the United States than anywhere else in the world, right? And so, what's amazing is that how attenuated that first bill had to be to make it through Congress, right? It applied only to a very limited set of drugs, and the notion that it's so natural now we can watch what's happening, right? We can learn the lessons of it, right? Communism did not take hold. We didn't see a drop in innovation or drug companies leaving the United States, and so why not expand that, across the entire spectrum of drugs? Seems like a brilliant and powerful proposal.
Well, Hal Singer, really appreciate your time today. Professor in the economics department at the University of Utah, executive director of the Utah Project, which is an institute studying antitrust and consumer protection. Thanks so much for your time today, Hal. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great one.
You too.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.